welcome back to my channel. Gosh, I've got a lot to talk about at the moment, that's why I'm doing lots of videos. Sometimes you'll find I do a torrent of videos, one after the other. Other times I'll go long periods without videos, just depends how much I've got to talk about really. But it's because I've been thinking a lot about the neurodiversity paradigm and how much I am against the neurodiversity paradigm, as I'm sure you're fully aware. And I'm not just sitting on the fence about this, I am very, very against the neurodiversity paradigm. And I'm very glad that the group I attend, which is a self-advocacy group in West Sussex, we're setting up a Disabled Autistics Matter group, which is a ripple in the ocean really in terms of challenging the NDM, but it's better than nothing. I mean, all we are is a very small group of disabled autistics, and yeah, we're challenging the NDM. We're trying to get into media and stuff like that and raise awareness of the plight of actually disabled autistics who do not think autism is just a natural variation, because I'll come on to that in a minute. Obviously it is a natural variation, but you know, anything that affects humans by definition is a natural variation, but it is not just a natural variation in terms of how the neurodiversity movement interpret it. So I've been thinking a lot about it lately, and I just want to talk a bit about autism and where we are with the term really, and my views on the matter. So when autism was originally defined back in the sort of 1940s, it was a very, very rare condition. Classical autism, as originally defined, was a very homogeneous grouping of people with a very stereotypical presentation. It was unmistakable. This is a very rare group of people, and it remains a very rare group of people. I don't know what the statistic is, but it's a very, very rare group of people who had this very narrowly defined, very clear condition, which is really striking in terms of its severity and abnormality, in terms of how radically different it is to the normal way of living. It's extreme. That was the kind of condition that was originally worked out by Canna, and then people like Uta Frith came on to study it later on. A very profoundly disabled group of children who were studied. Obviously, now this condition, which was at the time the classic definition of autism, it obviously still exists. These people are still out there. They have a very rare group of people. You know them when you see them. It's unmistakable. And they're homogenous enough for it to be a lot sort of, how can I say, maybe straightforward possibly to sort of work out underlying cognitive mechanisms and so on. Although obviously I don't think they've fully worked it out yet. But yeah, so that's what I want to say. Now, so later on it became apparent that there are a broader group of people who also have social abnormalities, social difficulties, and who display some similarities to this very rigidly defined narrow group, which was classic autism. And this obviously later came to be called Aspergers syndrome, which affects far more people, is less rare, but still quite rare actually, in its classic formulation. It's still comparatively rare, but nevertheless affects far more people than classic autism. It's not quite as dramatically abnormal, and yet is still unmistakable in its presentation. It is still a very unmistakable syndrome. When you see it, you know it, as it were. I can't remember if it was Lorna Wing or Uta Frith who said that when someone with Asperger's walks into a room, it's kind of pretty apparent very, very quickly that this person is different. Although obviously if you don't know about Asperger's, you might not know exactly what the difference is. But it's very clear that there's something a little bit different here. Or not just a little bit different, actually, quite extremely different. But the point I wanted to make is, it's never really been made clear whether or not Asperger's and classic autism are actually the same condition. how do we know that these two things are the same condition? What if we're actually creating a category mistake by assuming that they're part of the same category and treating them as like a sort of dimension, so that we have Asperger syndrome as a mild form of classic autism? That would only make sense if Asperger syndrome is on the same dimension as classic autism. But what if they're actually completely different conditions? What if it's like comparing chalk and cheese? So superficially similar, and yet actually radically different entities with possibly different underlying mechanisms, different causes. Now, they might possibly have some relationship in some cases. So you do often see in some families, not all, but in some families where you have lots of cases of Asperger's, you sometimes also see some cases of classic autism, suggesting there could be some genetic relationship between the two conditions. It's a suggestion, and it may well be the case in some families, but presumably not in all families. And I guess that would be a little bit like sometimes some forms of depression and schizophrenia, for example, two completely different conditions but can share some slight similarities, might possibly be genetically related in some families and co-occur together, and yet they're still different conditions. So what if Asperger's and classic autism are a bit like schizophrenia and depression? They share some similarities, like a depressed person can sometimes have, I think it's called negative affect. I only know this because I used to be a bit of a psychology nerd, and I did read quite a lot of abnormal psychology books. And I do know that people with schizophrenia, I think, show something called negative affect, where they don't show much facial expression and so on. That can actually sometimes be confused with Asperger's, actually. So there can be some diagnostic confusion sometimes between the two conditions. When psychiatrists don't really know too much about them. But certainly someone with depression can have negative affect. So can someone with schizophrenia, not showing much facial expression. And the two conditions could be confused sometimes, but they're two completely different conditions. People often think schizophrenia is more severe than depression, and yet obviously that's not really being completely accurate, because depression can be severe on its own terms, and if they're two different conditions, then it's kind of a bit meaningless to compare the two. So if Asperger's and classic autism are actually completely different to one another, I actually have a strong feeling they may well be actually completely different conditions, then it's absolutely meaningless to call them both autism. Maybe one of them could be called autism and one of them could be called completely different. Maybe we should actually reserve autism for what was the classic definition, and maybe what was called Asperger's need to be called something completely different, but made clear that it's a very serious condition nevertheless. I wouldn't mind if they did that. I would like scientific clarity here. Unfortunately, with the rise of the NDM and its wider autism spectrum, meaningless kind of, what the hell is it, where all of these conditions are lumped under the same umbrella, it's going to be an absolutely impossible task to work out what's what, because they've screwed it all up. That's no longer scientific. I strongly suspect that all of these conditions that we lump under autism are not related at all, or only very, very superficially. A bit like depression can sometimes share a similar genetic relationship with schizophrenia, because sometimes the two conditions can run in families, but not always, because there are different types of depression and there are different types of schizophrenia, and some types might be related, some types might not be related. So similarly, some types of Asperger's might be related to classic autism, some types might not be related at all, or only have a very slight possible genetic overlap. So I do very strongly have my very strong suspicions. Obviously this hasn't been scientifically verified, but nevertheless you can form hypotheses. That's what science is all about. Obviously I'm no scientist, that would have to be verified empirically by scientists, but I very strongly suspect that all these conditions that we call autism only bear a very passing superficial resemblance to one another, and we're actually talking about very different conditions that all affect social skills and all can result in repetitive and rigid behaviours. Just like depression and schizophrenia can share some surface similarities. Indeed, some depressive people even have something called psychotic depression, which can share even more of a similarity to certain types of schizophrenia and yet be a completely different condition. So conditions can share similar features, but that doesn't mean they're the same condition. I have absolutely no resemblance to someone like my second cousin. That's to say, she's quite far removed from me. I get confused about the whole cousin thing. It might be my third cousin, or I don't know how it's done. She's very removed from me anyway. It's basically my mum's cousin's daughter. she's extremely autistic, okay? You know, she would be like one of those classic ones, but she has like epilepsy, she can't speak, she's really, really, really handicapped. I've got no resemblance to her at all. We're completely different conditions, and yet she's also got the label autism. Well, yeah, and so have I, but I mean, we're completely different, so it makes absolutely no sense in a way for us both to share the same label. Either, you know what I mean? It makes absolutely no sense. So I just feel there needs to be more clarity here. And I feel it's a logical fallacy, actually, treating all of these conditions as the same thing. It's not helping anyone. So that's what I wanted to say firstly. So I'm going to move over to video number 2 now, just to carry on kind of just disentangling some ideas I've been thinking about. So moving on.